Let me tell you something about myself. I've always had a real interest in giant director-driven passion projects, or as I tend to call them, the big, hairy, audacious projects. The ones that filmmakers have just been dying to do, usually involving a specialist subject they're specifically fascinated by or have a personal relationship with, and almost always require cashing in their clout to accomplish. I don't know exactly what it is that I find personally inspiring. I mean, perhaps it's because I'm a ballsy dreamer who likes seeing someone gamble big and potentially win, or perhaps it's because I'm intellectually stimulated by what filmmakers choose to make when they're allowed the legroom of a multi-million-dollar budget in a Robert Moses Power Reveals kind of way. And over the decades, there have been some sizable names that have had the golden opportunity to make such a project. James Cameron had Titanic, Francis Ford Coppola had Apocalypse Now, Werner Herzog had Fitzcarraldo, Stanley Kubrick had a Napoleon project that sadly never got off the ground, Terry Gilliam had Don Quixote, Zack Snyder had Sucker Punch, Spike Lee had Malcolm X, Darren Aronofsky had The Fountain, David Fincher had Mank, Christopher Nolan had Inception, Mel Gibson had The Passion of the Christ, Michael Cimino had Heaven's Gate, Steven Spielberg currently has The Fabelmans, and Martin Scorsese of course had The Last Temptation of Christ, but this is the other one. Gangs of New York turned 20 years old late last year, and I find it to be a fascinating oddity of Scorsese's oeuvre. Not as out of place as Kundun, but, you know. It's a movie that's not often remembered as fondly as his other works, despite clearly having great effort and care sunk into it on the level of Scorsese's serious productions, and so I wanted to make this as a means of interrogating that. As has been pointed out by others, filmmakers who last long enough to have anything resembling a body of work will have minors and majors, and Gangs is considered one of Scorsese's minors, but for reasons that are not immediately obvious. Decades of stalling and various attempts to get things started, 3 years of production and $100 million of Miramax's money sunk into it, it is an undeniable passion project for Scorsese, and yet it's a work that's just not well remembered or even much talked about in retrospect, or at least not in the same way as Scorsese's definitive major works such as Taxi Driver, Raging Bull, The Last Temptation of Christ, Goodfellas, Casino, The Aviator, Hugo, The Wolf of Wall Street and The Irishman. I put The Aviator in there, by the way, because that is a personal favourite of mine, which is essentially to highlight that the minors-majors game is essentially arbitrary. You can arrange them however you please. Depending on who you ask, Cape Fear, The Departed and Hugo might be minor or major works depending on who you ask. Though it is worth noting, at least from my perspective, that Gangs of New York isn't nearly talked about as much as his definitive major works, despite the clear enthusiasm and attention to detail and care that went into it, and of course him shepherding the project after all those decades and finally getting it made. And that's what has me curious. The story goes that ever since he was a kid, Scorsese had a fascination with some of the really old architecture in and around his neighbourhood in Little Italy, namely the cobblestone paths and tombstones from St Patrick's Old Cathedral, and wondered of the lives of the Irish immigrants who had landed in America several generations before the Italian diaspora that would bring his grandparents to America. According to him, his father would often tell him these mythologically tinged stories about the old gangs of New York, like the 40 Thieves. Many years later, around the start of his serious film career, Scorsese finds a copy of The Gangs of New York by Herbert Ashbury at a friend's house in 1970, discusses it with Paul Schrader in 1972, and decides to eventually turn it into a film. The initial project was originally conceived back in 1977 with a screenplay by Jay Cox, cast, budget proposal, and was getting ready to make it straight after Raging Bull, but Heaven's Gate landed in 1980, followed shortly by One from the Heart in 1981, both of which utterly soured industry enthusiasm for gigantic director-driven passion projects, and so plans get immediately scuppered. For nearly 2 decades, Scorsese was telling his production designer Dante Ferretti that Gangs would be the next one, only to then be working on something else when the funding came through for one of his various other projects. After all that time, even with the clout Scorsese had and still has as a filmmaker, studios just weren't entirely comfortable with funding what was inevitably going to be an expensive production up front, never mind the kind of scope creep these kinds of projects tend to accumulate as the practical and material realities of completion become obvious. Just as a couple of industry examples, examples here. 20th Century Fox greenlit Titanic for a sizable $109 million in 1996, but after needing to become a co-production halfway through with Paramount, it ended up costing $200 million, very uncomfortably making it one of the most expensive movies ever at the time. And the fact that it was at all profitable, let alone being a smash hit, is nothing short of a miracle. Conversely, United Artists greenlit Heaven's Gate for $11.9 million in 1979, and it ended up costing 4 times that number by the time that it was finished, and its underperformance at the 1981 box office, principally because United Artists kept yanking it from theatres to recut several times following fiercely negative initial reviews, basically destroyed the studio and Michael Cimino's career. I use both of those examples there because as much as we may love big director-driven passion projects and just well-made art generally, there are real practical concerns about those kinds of big financially risky productions. Heaven's Gate flopping as the last of a series of expensive gambles that did similar business is basically the reason why Hollywood soured on director-led passion projects of the 70s and subsequently became a commercial powerhouse of producer-led blockbusters in the 80s, essentially creating the industry that we more or less still have now. What I'm saying is, despite the popular conception of big studios as capitalist art-destroying cowards, which, okay, fair enough, there is an arm's length worth of incentives and good reasons why we don't make juggernaut-sized niche movies like that anymore. Admittedly, those reasons are capitalist reasons, but they are reasons. He also highlights quite succinctly why Scorsese is understandably pissy that he had to take The Irishman to Netflix, and why he has negative opinions of the types of movies that are in theatres. But, as luck would have it, Scorsese was able to convince Leonardo DiCaprio to come on board as his lead actor, which whetted the appetite of a number of financiers, and after more offers started to come through, Scorsese was able to secure funding in 1999 thanks to... Wait, where is that music coming from? Oh no! Oh no! Yep, that's right. Notorious sex criminal and occasional film producer Harvey Weinstein agreed to finance the film. He even put his name on it in one of his select few non-executive producer credits, meaning that if the movie won Best Picture at the Academy Awards, which he'd been really gunning for with his famously aggressive For Your Consideration campaigning of the 90s, he wanted to make sure that his name was on the trophy. So yeah, Harvey signs on board as producer, and because the budget needs to be about $83 million, he immediately sold the international distribution rights to GK Films, then called Initial Entertainment Group, for $65 million, which he then reinvested back into the production. After which Touchstone Pictures, a division of Disney who at the time owned Miramax, decided to come on board as a co-production, and hey presto, Scorsese's decades-long dream project is finally in production. And credit where it's due, because I am going to talk some trash later on, it is an impressively wrought film. The thing itself looks remarkable. Like, this is the sum of 40 years of consideration and preparation on the part of the director and production designer. It does feel somewhat redundant to start off by saying, well, it looks great because, that's what they paid for, but the end product is quite awesome, and I mean that in the classic sense of the word. Dante Ferretti's production design in collaboration with Industrial Lights and Magic and Michael Bullhouse's cinematography is gorgeous. Ferretti was a long-time collaborator of Scorsese's, and here he does some of his career best work in bringing 1800s New York to life on Cinecitta's stage. The sheer size of the set, a 15-acre intricately detailed recreation of Paradise Square, lends an inherent visceral physicality to the space that is sadly absent in a lot of contemporary epic cinema. There's a strong palpability, a feelable quality to the muck and grime that washes the scenery. What's striking about the film is that Scorsese's use of violence and staging here makes the period feel positively ancient. There's a strong sense of barbarism and ugliness to both the politics and environment of the time, all in support of the tagline's proposition that America was born in the streets. Civilization, as it were, still seems like a century away, even for the land of the free. It's almost as if Scorsese has kind of crafted a war drama in an almost medieval style, as though New York was an ancient battleground where people made declarative statements before charging into the Battle of Agincourt. There is a deliberate mythic quality to the movie where characters seem to exist in symbolic terms and speak declaratively, similar to that of an old western, except in a setting where characters are crushed together rather than on a wide open landscape. landscape. Stylistically speaking, and as a period piece, it's got more in common with something like Braveheart or 300 than it does Titanic or even Scorsese's own The Age of Innocence, set during roughly the same period. What's particularly strong here is the communication of the dire and deeply poverty-stricken nature of the period. 5 Points during this time was experiencing its worst economic and social depravity for a 70-year period, with a huge population density, unemployment, organised crime and various serious diseases being considered by historians as endemic to the area. As a big-budget enterprise with vast physical environments, it stands as one of the very last of its kind, as digital cinematography, blue screens and CGI were very quickly becoming the norm at the turn of the millennium. The film, being produced roughly side by side with The Lord of the Rings and the prequel Star Wars film, marks as an almost analogous parallel between the very grandest of cinema's past and the inevitability of cinema's digital future. There's actually only one entirely CGI effect in the entire film, and it's this elephant in the finale, which only needed doing because of some botched communication with the animal handler, and so George Lucas and his team did Scorsese a favour. All of this cumulatively adds up to a production that feels remarkably credible. Like, this is hands down one of the most impeccably realised period settings for a movie ever, so genuinely big kudos to Dante Ferretti and his team, along with costume designer Sandy Powell and cinematographer Michael Ballhaus. Bravo. The problems begin, however, when you need to, tell a story. The Gangs of New York by Herbert Ashbury is a non-fiction anecdotal account of the history of New York's organised crime from the 18th century up to 1928 when the book was completed. Part of the adaptive challenge is in trying to drive a narrative through all, if not most of that, whilst trying to capture the nature of the period and the contextual landscape that it existed within. So it's a question of what you emphasise, what political relations do you highlight, from whose perspective do you centre the story on, what things they bear witness to, which important historical figures they're reasonably able to meet, what events they help facilitate, so on and so forth. And so they decided to invent a character by the name of Amsterdam Vallen, created mostly out of whole cloth, though he does have some basis analogously with John Morrissey, have his father be murdered by William Poole, thus setting up our key villain, and have the main through line be his adult quest to take bloody vengeance upon him. They knew going in that they wanted the film to end on the draft riots as the final shocking climactic set piece, and boy howdy am I going to talk about exactly what they did with that, and so they worked backwards from there in setting up the complicated social, economic and political factors that added up to that terrible event. What they wanted to depict was the interconnected web of wants, needs and incentives that made up the social landscape of the 5 Points. The gangs who lived in the direst poverty and formed together as a series of fragile alliances where no one can truly trust anyone else, and the deep racial, religious and class divides that split the city up like one of Bill's carving knives. Scorsese said that it was important for him to show the period as being like a powder keg, where a huge burst of violence threatens to erupt at any given moment, which, in the end, it eventually would. And this is all great from a starting point. Like, this is genuinely the makings of a good plan and a decent outline for the intent of the project, but it's ultimately a matter of how do you create a protagonist through line that adequately draws a through line through all of that. Now, one of the things that Scorsese is typically very good at is dealing with personal narratives across long stretches of time. Taxi Driver, Raging Bull, Goodfellas, Casino, The Aviator, The Wolf of Wall Street and The Irishman all achieve this brilliantly. He has an impeccable eye towards storytelling macro, whilst also keeping you engaged with individual sequences along the way, favouring an episodic structure as a means to cover more ground and allow for stronger characterisation. Funny how am I funny, and all that. Whilst he clearly wanted this to have a more wandering slice-of-lifeness to it, you still require some good, compelling personal drama to centre that on. Travis Bickle struggling existentially as his job makes him suffer through New York's seedy nightlife, Jake LaMotta's struggling family life as he struggles his way upward in the ring, Henry Hill growing his cocaine business behind Paulie's back, Ace Rosenthal running his casino for the Chicago mob whilst it costs him his friends along the way, Howard Hughes trying and increasingly failing to manage his OCD as his career takes off, and Jordan Belfort stealing his way upward and becoming more paranoid as his relationships erode and the FBI tail him, stuff like that. And the trouble is, Amsterdam turns out to be quite an anemic character to centre the movie on, especially given that he's up against a far more strongly characterised villain. As a character, the big issue that hangs over Amsterdam is that he's kind of a Lego brick, in part because he needs to fulfill the need of being a relatively neutral pair of eyes through which we witness the period, and in another part because the fact that he's invented from whole cloth means that his agency cannot conflict with period events, and so he's narrowly saddled with a very simple, single-minded revenge quest. There's an overall blank quality that permeates much of his character. He never knew Ireland in order to effectively miss it, and his opinions of being in America aren't anything he particularly struggles with. His father having been murdered is his primary motivation, but it's only at very select moments, which is to say a handful, that we actually see him deal with it. Plus, he doesn't really encounter much in the way of anti-Irish racism personally. It's only a conflict in that it slightly delays him getting familiar with Bill. He gets into a fight with Bill's Irish lieutenant, and then it's basically happy families from there. Bill is all too happy to let him in. The Conscription Act gets a mention well before the draft riots happen, but the future implications of that aren't adequately explored. Given the recruiters don't dare ask after any gang members, Amsterdam doesn't seem to consider this as a threat to his own livelihood, and come the draft riots itself, he's already at war with the natives and thus mostly isolated from the rest of the rioting. So his story of him and his people trying to live and breathe in the land of the free doesn't actually have much weight to it in the dramatic sense, and it misses many golden opportunities to explore the psychological perspective of what it meant and currently means to be Irish in America through this character. The one key character conflict he does have, of wanting to kill this brute thug whose power and command over the city he low-key respects, whilst potentially interesting and both DiCaprio and Lewis sell it hard, ends up being quite underdeveloped, in large part because the story isn't arranged in a way that deals with it directly. I mean, the strongest parts of Scorsese's best movies are often because he's not explicitly plot-focused, but due to the movie's runtime and desire to include historical details and what people's lives were like, the effect is that Gangs of New York ends up being a near 3-hour sightseeing tour that rather begrudgingly has a revenge plot in it. I also feel like the key to Scorsese's work is that more often than not, his protagonists are insider anti-heroes who are able to offer us a perspective and guidance on the absurd worlds that they occupy. Like, Henry Hill shows us how the mob works, Ace and Nicky show us how the casino works, Jordan Belfort tries to show us how the financial world works, the inscrutability of which is made into a gag.
I know you're not following what I'm saying anyway, right? That's okay, that doesn't matter. The real question is this: was all this legal? Absolutely fucking not.
And Amsterdam doesn't really do that for us. Several decades pass before he re-enters New York as an adult, and whilst his narration tries to compensate and add context, we're ultimately just as lost in the swirling world of details as he is. The sad part is, I feel like there is some real room to manoeuvre here. Somewhere within the text, there is a potential Hamlet-like version of Amsterdam as a somewhat tragic figure who conflicts between taking revenge for his father and his affection for a man who has, in effect, become like a new father. There's potential room for exploration in the immigrant identity story of a man who has had to integrate a new father figure as much as they've integrated a new homeland, and how both fundamentally do not respect him because of who he is. Some of this is what the movie is already doing, and there's glimpses of brilliance there, but this potential is squandered due to incongruous plotting where Amsterdam interacts with never-ending slice-of-life set pieces, and for that reason the whole thing feels like it's buying time until the fire-eating ceremony, after which we're suddenly in a real hurry to get over the finish line once it knows it has only one major bit of scenery left. And once that's accomplished, there's the friends who have died by being dragged into the conflict for Amsterdam to mourn, which is a good idea, but because it's not foreshadowed, there's only really this one scene at the tail end to do it any kind of justice. There's no implication or consideration that going to war with Bill might kill his own friends, which is ultimately what happens. So the revenge plot sucks, for the most part, because of its stark simplicity, and in fact happens to one side of the events that lead into the draft riots, and the reason why is because it's set in stone and Amsterdam's agency cannot interact with it. His revenge plot isn't effectively used to thread that needle, and it ends up feeling like such small potatoes compared to the larger societal battleground that it takes place on. And so, because of the inadequate character work and wonky structuring, Amsterdam taking on Bill Cutting in a valiant last stand fails to have the power and impact it sorely needs, because it takes place on a backdrop that Amsterdam just doesn't really have any stake in. The movie can't engage with any of its component parts in any particularly strong way for fear of disturbing historical events too much, and so it ends up feeling all so terribly empty. It's a movie so ornate, so pregnant with historical detail, intricacy, inner life and lore that all plot ultimately wanders around it to keep it preserved, as though it were tiptoeing around a vase on a pedestal. As a movie, Gangs of New York's biggest failing is in how it struggles to engage with all the various threads that it's trying to juggle. It's a revenge story with a love triangle and a political power struggle on the backdrop of the Civil War, with underground boxing, a ballroom sequence, several epic fights, and an election campaign. It's kind of a pig's ear, to be quite honest. And the reason for this is, in all likelihood, probably down to how it's not much of a secret that Harvey Weinstein and Martin Scorsese clashed near constantly during production regarding what the movie ought to fundamentally be. Publicly, the two have stated that they both had one vision, which is Marty's vision, but then you hear the story about Harvey not allowing Marty the resources to build the exterior to St. Patrick's Old Cathedral and him just doing it anyway, or Harvey not liking the actual factual name of the Irish gang, the Dead Rabbits, and so Scorsese responded by flipping a table and walking out, or how Harvey complained via memo that Leonardo DiCaprio had too much grease in his hair and so Scorsese really rubbed it in when he saw him next in person, or how Scorsese had mirrors mounted on the side of his director's monitor so that he always knew when Harvey was coming, or indeed how Scorsese was filming the final sequences with Amsterdam and Bill stabbing each other whilst the crew were literally tearing the set down off camera because it was the last day of a very long shoot and Harvey would not let them spend any more money in it. Kind of puts a bunch of holes in that. In the years since, Scorsese has, for the most part, chosen to remain quiet about what exactly went down, and researching this video proved to be quite hard because Miramax kept everything pretty close to the chest. And so, as to acknowledge the limits of my own understanding, there is going to be a lot of supposedly coming up, and you should probably take what I say with a pinch of salt. Though, if you fancy some extracurricular material, I would personally recommend both Scorsese A Retrospective by Tom Schon and Down and Dirty Pictures by Peter Biskind, both of which I found to be very helpful. On some level, and this is my personal opinion, I feel like Harvey Weinstein wanted this to be his Titanic, it having only recently become one of the highest grossing movies ever in 1997, and so a lot of what he wanted to do with Gangs of New York seems to point the production in that kind of very commercial direction. Miramax had been on a roll from the late 80s through to the 90s and were on their way to becoming a minor major, and their strategy had been to start putting serious money into bigger movies than the indie fare that they'd founded the company on. Gangs of New York being their first major homegrown project in this spirit alongside Cold Mountain, and they were in desperate need of some big hits to justify the scope of what they were in the middle of producing. Supposedly, the company wanted their minor projects like Kate and Leopold to be big hits for them in 2001 as a way to tide them over before their major outings hit theatres, but sadly ended up disappointing. Though Chicago ended up doing big business for them in 2002, supposedly those earnings were negated by the amount of money that Gangs of New York had previously cost them to produce. I mean, I suppose in one sense Gangs of New York is Titanic, in the sense that it went over budget, over schedule, and there were loads of technical issues that needed addressing daily, but more specifically in the sense that it's a similarly packaged film. We've got ourselves a star-studded cast, a period setting, epic scale, a romantic through line, a big award season campaign with 10 nominations, even down to having an original song composed for the end credits by U2 of all goddamn people. I guess Enya was already occupied doing Lord of the Rings. Like, in all fairness, you could maybe see why Harvey wanted this to be as commercial as possible, especially given how much it was going to cost him. Basically, as I said, a lot of the fighting seemed to be down to the fundamental shape of the movie. Scorsese wanted it to be a more thoroughly realised slice of life of the period, more episodic, more focused on the daily violence, the well-being and the politics of the lives of the people who lived and struggled in 5 Points. But Weinstein was the one that was pushing for it to be more explicitly plot-focused, i.e. making sure that the revenge plot and love triangle are at all times within eyesight. And so he's responsible for the movie having narration by Amsterdam, by having the love triangle being more pronounced in the final edit, and indeed having the very marquee-friendly Cameron Diaz cast as Jenny Everdeen, who, God bless her for trying, cannot convincingly be Irish to save her life.
Gentlemen, I leave you in the grace and favour of the Lord.
Okay, to be completely fair, it's not like DiCaprio does that much better.
But I'd check my pockets if I was you, because I do believe she lifted your timepiece.
While we're here, there is a deeper problem with Jenny, which is that her inclusion feels entirely perfunctory. You could cut her from the movie completely and her absence wouldn't really be felt. You might think Jenny is important to creating tension between Amsterdam and Bill, but regarding that, the character that actually matters is Johnny. Fun fact, that's Henry Thomas, the kid from E.T. Once Johnny becomes jealous of Amsterdam and Jenny hooking up, he then rats to Bill about his revenge. There's at least 1 or 2 degrees of separation there. You may as well have Johnny be jealous of Amsterdam being favoured by Bill as he becomes his right-hand man. Also, why would Johnny be mad about Jenny hooking up with Amsterdam? He knows that she's a sex worker. Not to mention, there is initially some tension to the fact that Jenny was taken in at a young age by Bill, and that does drive a wedge between her and Amsterdam.
Is there anyone in the 5 Points you haven't fucked?
Yes! You!
But that swiftly disappears almost as soon as it arrives. It just makes you wonder why Jenny is even here at all. She doesn't do anything for the climax either. She gives Amsterdam the opportunity to walk away with her to California, but as soon as she tries to get away scot-free, the draft rights happen and she's back to Amsterdam in time for that finale. I'm not trying to take away female representation here, it's just that the intent behind her character is so very thin that the movie struggles for things for her to do, to the degree that she may as well not be here. But anyway, they finished production around mid-2001 and thus begins a long editing process, in part because of further squabbling between the director and producer, but in large part because post 9/11 there was a significant internal worry at Miramax that American audiences just weren't going to want a movie full of violence with a climax that features mass civilian casualties, and so they pushed back their original release window of Christmas 2001 by a year so that they can do further work. There was a near 4-hour work print that they needed to somehow make a saleable movie out of, and it was Harvey Weinstein that wanted it cut much shorter. Though, to be fair, Scorsese's contract did say that they had both agreed to produce a film at no more than 2 hours 40, which I think if you take the credits off, the final film does just about make it within that criteria. Now, briefly, just so nobody gets the wrong impression here, I feel the need to talk about work prints a little bit because a lot of people tend to misunderstand when you hear stuff like Apocalypse Now having over 1 million feet of film shot and thus having a 5-hour work print, or Zack Snyder's infamous work print of Justice League being 9 hours, and naturally assume that it was at one point the original intended version or some sort of director's cut. The work print is basically the first draft of the movie as a movie, which is to say it has all of the original intended material that was scripted and or some extras laid end to end in scene order just to see if any of it actually works or can be improved upon through further iteration or indeed needs to be removed entirely. This is where you get deleted scenes from. The work print is almost always the longest and roughest version of any given movie, as it serves as the basis for which all departments can just see the thing, what needs doing, and start their own work with their own copy without much supervision. Foley, sound effects, VFX and score, all of which can be implemented after picture lock, where the general editing is finalised and no major changes need to be made. The reason why the work print being on the long side is important for our purposes here is because studios are typically hostile to anything over 2 hours, because the longer a movie is, the fewer theatrical screenings you can get in a given day. So in the case of long work prints, the incentive from the studio to take more material out of the work print weighs significantly in the final edit. So whilst Gangs of New York's work print clocked in at around 3 hours 40, this was nowhere near going to be its intended final length, especially given Scorsese's contract. And as long as I'm here, Harvey Weinstein was often known for wanting to cut movies shorter, particularly foreign language films that he'd gotten the distribution rights for, and thus he was often dubbed Harvey Scissorhands. Supposedly, there was a cut which Harvey had made which was around 1.5 hours to 2 hours, but it basically played like a highlight reel and nobody, including Harvey, liked it at all. This went on until they found a length where the movie worked, according to Scorsese, and so the final cut, as it currently stands, is a compromise in the massive creative tug-of-war going on. This compromise creates some very noticeable pacing problems. This is a hard issue to demonstrate in the context of a video essay, but at 2 hours 46, the climax in particular really suffers in truncation. The first half of the movie has plenty of legroom to take in scenery and characters, and it establishes a certain rhythm with which to engage with it, but around the end of the second hour, things just sharply start sprinting towards the finish line. Like, Amsterdam reforms the dead rabbit so fast after he's horrifically scarred that as a plot point, it's not really allowed to simmer or gestate. It's in such a hurry to acknowledge and then move past that fundamental shift in power in 5 points, a moment that could be more potent in a movie with a more confident third act. Same goes with Monk being killed. His funeral happens so quickly that its only purpose becomes Bill accepting Amsterdam's challenge, which could have been staged literally any other way. And to cap it off, the time between Bill being stabbed to death and the end credits starting to roll is about 4 minutes. It's like you can almost hear Harvey Weinstein put his foot down on the pedal to get the thing to the ending quicker. Though apparently Scorsese had a 3.5 hour version on videotape that he made available to his friends, and supposedly it played much better, so who knows if we'll all eventually get to see that. There was also an entire score by Elmer Bernstein that just got thrown out and replaced with the temp music they were using, bombastic, high-energy contemporary music from Peter Gabriel that just barely complements the action. And Howard Shore's score that they did use is almost certainly borrowed/leftovers from an entirely different project. Okay, I can't actually confirm that to be true, but the big question mark for me is, why would you name your main theme Brooklyn Heights when the movie is quite definitively set in Paradise Square in 5 points? The long and the short of it is that if it feels like a 4-hour movie where the third and the fourth hour had just been cut together, that's because it basically is. Hence the pig's ear nature of what we're dealing with. And it's a shame because, as I said, there is some genuinely great material in here that could have been more prominent if the edit wasn't so smothered. Like here, there's a great one-er where we see Irish families arrive at the harbour, and as soon as they're greeted, husbands then sign for both citizenship and union service, are given a uniform and a rifle, say goodbye to their families, and aboard the boat opposite, which is headed for Tennessee, currently at the dock, offloading the bodies of soldiers that they had brought back, all set to the tune of Paddy's Lamentation. That's just a really great sequence of images placed back to back, and it does a bunch of things at once. It shows the poor and vulnerable strong-armed into the military, shows the callousness of Tammany Hall, and the end product of meat being sent to the grinder. It's rather poignant.
Prepare to receive the true Lord!
The opening sequence is suitably grand and graphic, though it's marred by some weird editing decisions and bad soundtrack. The Butcher's Apprentice sequence is one of Scorsese's great movie scenes. There's plenty of great tension thanks to the blocking and the space between shots, and DiCaprio does an excellent job selling Amsterdam slowly lose his composure as the act gets more dangerous. It threatens to go sideways at any moment, and you can't strictly tell where Bill is just toying with both Jenny and Amsterdam, or if he's that skilled and is going through the motions. The whole scene and the fire-eating ceremony afterwards, end to end, is the moment where the plot is at its highest stakes and Scorsese exercises his greatest strengths as a storyteller. And afterwards, I love the fact that Bill never takes his eye off Amsterdam as he sips the flame, almost daring Amsterdam to make the first move. Speaking of Bill, this is just a great visual moment that demonstrates the stranglehold he has over the city, even if it is a touch on the nose.
Each of the 5 points is a finger. When I close my hand, it becomes a fist. And any time that I wish, I can turn it against you.
Generally speaking, Bill the Butcher is a terrifically realised character. I mean, on the page, he's kind of a blunt instrument because, like, he's so openly racist, unpleasant, and refuses to entertain civility with those he deems his enemies. And so the way that Scorsese has other characters interact with and approach him, how they treat him with deference and offer him tributes for fear of hostility, does a lot for his character. Given that I described earlier the issues with the wandering sightseeing plot, it's down to Daniel Day-Lewis to facilitate drama. His bill cutting, his sublime sense of presence within that character is where all the story tension is filtered through in a very I am the author of all your pain way. He commands the rooms that he stands in, essentially becoming one with the scenery, the god of this universe, and so it's for that reason that he's used as the thematic centre. His whole deal is that whilst he stands as the underground kingmaker of New York, as the movie progresses he becomes more and more out of place as democracy, such as it is, takes its hold in America. He presents himself as a gentleman, as possessing and facilitating civility and peace amongst the underclass, but like a king, that civility is based on the implied violence of disrespecting his asserted authority. It being a front especially becomes obvious to those he subjugates when offered an opportunity to talk with a victorious opponent, where he then butchers him to death in the street. Even corrupt city leader Boss Tweed sees it for himself. Thematically and spiritually, Bill belongs in the past, which is why he is to be destroyed by our heroic protagonist, framed as akin to St. Michael.
And what did he do?
He cast Satan out of paradise.
Good boy.
There are a number of liberties taken with history to make this work, mind, which is something that Gangs of New York is somewhat notorious for. It's been both praised and derided for its very selective historical accuracy. Set designs, costume, and cinematography are on point, but characters and events distinctly less so. Bill cutting is largely based on William Poole and his activities in the Know Nothing Party, who was a famously short-tempered butcher and pugilist, also nicknamed Bill the Butcher, but Poole did not actually live to see the Civil War due to his murder in 1855, largely claimed to have been arranged by John Morrissey, but the movie needs a clear, identifiable villain to hang dramatic conflict on, and who better than the leader of the nativist anti-Irish Bowery Boys to achieve that, so here he is alive and well in 1863. And again, all this is in service of a thematic, mythological view of New York's history. The epic sweep, the grandeur of the tone, the violent struggles in the streets between warring tribes. What Scorsese is essentially trying to present here is a fight for the soul of America. What the melting pot was to become, what world might spring forward from the powder keg.
It wasn't a city, really. It was more a furnace, where a city someday might be forged.
That is at least some of the idea behind using the draft riots as the final set piece, one last violent surge of the old world before being put down and forcibly civilized by the armed forces. This is certainly evident in the way that Scorsese talks about the film and what drew him to the project in the first place.
The country was up for grabs, and New York was a powder keg. This was the America not of the West, with its wide open spaces, but of claustrophobia, where everyone was crushed together. On one hand, you had the first great wave of immigration, the Irish, who were Catholic, spoke Gaelic, and owed allegiance to the Vatican. On the other hand, there were the nativists, who felt that they were the ones who had fought and bled and died for the nation. They looked at the Irish coming off the boat and said, "What are you doing here?" It was chaos, tribal chaos. Gradually, there was a street-by-street, block-by-block working out of democracy as people learned somehow to live together. If democracy didn't happen in New York, it wasn't going to happen anywhere.
And it's like, yeah, nice tweet, Marty, but making the assumption that America somehow learned to live together and hold hands in political and societal harmony is somewhat disingenuous. So the movie thinks that its message is about democracy, that the American political machine is essentially a form of gang warfare between various communal tribes and fragile alliances of differing social groups, that democracy was forged in the fires of these old battles, and that over time, violence has been replaced by politics as the mode of social movement and expression. Essentially, as per the movie, American democracy is a history of American factionalism, where you might call the working class a faction, or queer people, or Latin Americans, or Republicans, or any number of distinct social groups you care to think of, and that the engine of American society is the confluence of these various groups, with often competing motives and incentives, all trying to further their own causes for influence and or resources. And the thing is, it's not 1,000,000% off base, especially given how gangs are often formed as a means of community solidarity amongst the impoverished, enterprising, building alliances, and collectively pooling resources for the common good. But I get curious, however, by the word democracy here, because I don't think Scorsese has depicted democracy. It's a circle that the movie is constantly trying to square, and this really comes to a head within the final moments, laying bare some of the dangers of mythological storytelling and selective historical accuracy to tell that story. To use an old Scorsese quote, cinema is a matter of what's in the frame and what's not in the frame, and what's in the frame isn't democracy, but violence. Specifically, racial violence. So for those that don't know, because I certainly didn't before working on this, the draft riots were a very destructive civil disturbance in 1863 in response to the culmination of laws that Congress passed earlier in the year, namely the Enrollment Act, to establish the first ever state-mandated military service program determined by way of lottery to enlist men to fight in the Civil War, which, from the perspective of the Union, were greatly needed. Despite Union states being free and emancipation having been achieved in New York by 1827, black men were excluded from the draft on the count of not being considered citizens, and wealthy white men would be allowed to pay a fee to avoid being drafted, effectively cordoning the recruitment efforts onto poor working class groups, mostly Irish but also German, who had no means to not be drafted and were thus being made to shoulder the brunt of the war effort. The result was a riot that lasted several days beginning on the second day of the draft, with mass assaults, ransacking and arson taking place, with at least 50 buildings, including 2 Protestant churches and the Coloured Orphan Asylum, being burned to the ground. Specifically, it was an event that saw racial tensions between white and black working class groups boil over, with many black people beaten, tortured and lynched, with their homes and businesses destroyed and or burned down. It was an event that has gone down as one of the most racially charged instances of civil unrest in American history, comparable in scale to something like the Black Wall Street Massacre. All roads of Gangs of New York's plot lead through the draft riots, and it quite profoundly does not work at all. Putting the bloody climax of your revenge story on the backdrop of a huge public act of racism massively undermines both of them. These two things are not peanut butter and chocolate. One of these is vengeance taken for the slaying of an immigrant by the hands of a violent nativist, and the other is a hate crime against black people fueled by a callous, classist disregard for the poor on behalf of the federal government. These events, side by side, do not complement each other. From a story perspective, this does not work as an ending set piece because none of the principal characters have any real agency in creating the circumstances circumstances for it to occur, or through inaction allow it to occur. It is a background inevitability, a set piece none of the characters can influence, and so it becomes the backdrop of their interpersonal war, and in doing so, barely allows for any kind of introspection or explanation of why one of the most violent ethnic riots in America's history actually occurred. And keep in mind, they wanted the movie to end like this. This idea was one of the very few that reliably stuck around from 1977, and instead of designing a plot that goes through the draft riots to function as the conclusion to what they set up, the Dead Rabbits versus the Natives is entirely adjacent to the rioting. The gangs agree to meet on the given date, the riots start, the gangs make their preparations, each approach each other, the military shells the streets to disperse everyone, and Bill and Amsterdam stab each other amidst the fog of what remains. The way that the interplay of cuts puts these characters at war amongst this real historical event through traditional cinematic language is supposed to create a thematic parallel explicitly that these two things are being drawn in comparison, and that comparison is just not there. Most importantly, neither side of the central conflict of the movie, neither the Irish or the natives, are representative of the exploited black population who were overwhelmingly the actual casualties of the rioting, not the wealthy institutions who created the circumstances for that rioting to occur. Given how much of the story is rooted in historical racism, the movie isn't at all concerned with the racism and slavery of African Americans. They're a tertiary consideration, largely in the background of the plot to make way for the Irish versus the natives. There is at least one black member of the Dead Rabbits, Jimmy Spoils, played by Lawrence Gilead Jr., but that's really about it in terms of representation. Black Americans are by and large used as cannon fodder, as collateral damage in the wider struggle for democracy between two groups of white people, one with more social standing than the other, fighting and dying over what it means to be a white, respectable American. The same applies for the Chinese Americans, who exist and about whom nothing much else can be said. The Civil War, which was ongoing at the time of the setting, is used exclusively as the backdrop for this story, which is odd because if we're so concerned with the conquest of democracy, then why not hear more directly from the people whose freedoms the country was literally at war over? I'm not asking for the movie to suddenly be about black characters, nor am I trying to downplay the racial tension between African and Irish working class groups, both of whom were competing over labour, but given how much the movie wants to reference the deeply rooted racism of the period, the only racism the movie has any empathetic ears for is the interpersonal racism between two sectarian white groups. In the draft riot sequence itself, the camera specifically focuses our attention on the white working class rioters' anger and them fighting with the militia groups trying to put them down. The violent conflict is seen mostly from the perspective of the poor versus the wealthy and the people versus the army. You'd be forgiven for thinking that there were no black people in 5 Points up until the exact moment that Scorsese felt like showing a few of them being lynched in the street. The movie doesn't even mention that black men were ineligible from the draft in the first place, and so them suddenly being lynched as part of their anger against the wealthy suddenly just seems to happen for no ulterior reason. Scorsese specifically laser focuses on the class disparity of the inciting incident that he overlooks and in some respects ignores the race riot the incident was. It is genuinely quite baffling to me to frame the conquest of democracy over barbarism on the backdrop of an event that, by most estimates, saw 120 black people lynched and thousands injured because white people refused to be sent to war because they believed that there were perfectly good black people who ought to die first. Like, I'm no historian, let alone an American historian, but even I can see that that's super fucking dodgy. Whilst the driving impetus behind the inciting incident was indeed Irish working class resentment at the wealthy who had the means to pay to avoid the draft, the end result of that was a race riot. Like, black people were lynched. The black population of New York fell below 11,000 for the first time in 50 years, and the coloured orphan asylum, seen at the time as a symbol of white charity to black impoverished children, was burned to the ground. Not to mention, because all story drama is filtered through Bill the Butcher and his death is marked as the end of a brutal period of American history, his symbolic defeat ends up individualising racism in America as opposed to a systemic problem that continues to affect American life well into the 21st century. The draft riots are a good set piece to end a movie about democracy and racism on, but it's inappropriate at best and grossly offensive at worst to end this movie on given what the actual plot is. Because the fact of the matter is that it wasn't a heroic last stand between warring tribes fighting for the soul of America, it was a deep-rooted failure of American society. It was a failure of human rights as the federal government enforced conscription on those who hadn't the means to opt out. It was a failure of the various competing municipalities to not properly cordon off the rioters. And most crucially, it represents a complete failure of community solidarity, with the rioters fighting to have their newly freed fellow man sent to die instead of themselves, despite the fact that they literally couldn't be because they weren't considered fellow citizens, the flames of which were fanned by scaremongering opportunists with a vested interest in keeping the working class killing each other in the streets. And all of that represents the soul of America? Well, I mean, he's not strictly speaking wrong, is he? America is a country defined by and marred in violence, conflict, and warfare. It's a country that was founded in war, industrialized in a war, and became a global superpower in a war. War is an inescapable reality of American history, and so it feels appropriate to frame the American democratic process itself as a kind of factionless turf war, where most, if not all, progress is a battleground to be fought for. Women's suffrage, civil rights, Roe v. Wade, Stonewall, trans rights, Black Lives Matter, take your pick. No less than Martin Luther King famously said that freedom is never given voluntarily by the oppressor, it must be demanded by the oppressed. But is that process really democracy? Is that really deliberation? Is this what America is made of? It's a bit of a profane thought, but depending on who you ask, the answer is yes. It represents a particularly ugly and pessimistic view of American history, and I honestly don't think that's what Scorsese means. I think Scorsese quite sincerely wants to have made a film about the struggle to have built democracy on top of the old world. In Scorsese's film, he seems to imply that the draft riots represent a maturing point in New York's history, ending with the building of the contemporary skyline atop the ruins, as though to surpass them, meant as a hopeful image for audiences then still reeling from 9/11. The city may burn and the buildings may fall, but we can rebuild. It's a romantic thought, and one America, New York especially, probably greatly needed at the time. But to me, in retrospect, it implies not that America surpassed those ruins, but are firmly rooted in them. That it's not so much the old world being left behind, but the new world being born of the failings of the old one. William Poole is dead, the devil cast out of paradise supposedly, but the same corrupt and corrupting power structures that allowed Poole to fester, that are designed to maintain an underclass, that incentivise the wealthy to take advantage of the poor, that approves of the non-white having their humanity denied by their comparatively disempowered counterparts, that views the poor as a pitiable nest of rats whose poverty is its own moral failing, whose rage needs to be quelled at the end of a rifle by the state. It's all still around. You can cast out as many William Pooles as you like, but the underlying structure remains. If the 2 decades since 2002 have demonstrated anything, it's that America still doesn't know how to live together. The working out of democracy, street by street, block by block, is very much an ongoing project. Factionalism and violence still exist across wealth, across race, across gender, sexuality, religion, and good old-fashioned political ideology. America's founding principles may have been based on the prospect of liberty and freedom from tyranny, but American history is a long succession of attempts and failures to live up to those principles. Civilization still seems like a century away, even for the land of the free. But the ongoing project need not strictly be a bad thing, as the concept of what it means to be an American is not static. It's always going to be in flux. It's not set in stone, and you should always be wary of those who insist that it is. Unless you're native, actually native, every person in the United States is a descendant of an immigrant. The immigrant story in American history is as bound to the foundations of the country as war is. In my view, the soul of America worth fighting for is a conglomeration of all kinds of people trying to live, and it's white supremacy and poverty that go hand in hand in pitting the poor against each other. The problem is the movie's attitude towards racial groups is just as segregated and individualistic as the antagonists in a very neoliberal way. It de facto accepts the worldview that these groups should be fighting over resources without argument, because it kind of agrees that resources belong to the worthy, the deserving, those more willing to die for them than anyone else, seemingly unwilling to question the fact that the situation is manufactured and arbitrary, despite being clearly aware that resources are withheld by the powerful for the purpose of making people fight to acquire them.
You can always hire one half of the poor to kill the other half.
Gangs of New York claims to depict the struggle for democracy at the turn of the century, but I sincerely don't think Scorsese has made that film. Because a movie in this setting about democracy would recognise the power structures that pit people against each other for essentials. It would realise that Bill is a head on a hydra, that no matter who takes his place for good or ill, the structure would remain unchallenged. It would show that the rules don't apply to the wealthy and how the moralisation of the poor exists to keep the poor in their place. It would show that community solidarity between groups of impoverished people can form alliances by working together and fighting for their mutual liberation. And importantly, it would show that all would-be Americans have a place in the land of the free, regardless of perceived lack of dues paid or unwillingness to die for corrupt institutions. The sad irony is that in trying to make a film about American democracy and the struggles of various racialized communities, Scorsese accidentally made a film that quite accurately depicts America's continued failure to understand those things. Armed with 1,000-old nostalgic folktales from his father and Herbert Ashbury's book, Scorsese aims to make a film that genuinely challenged the way that America imagines itself, and in doing so, made a film that ultimately succumbs to the exact same historical revisionism of America's self-image. And yes, America may have been born in the streets, as the tagline so elegantly proposes, but who's to say that America ever truly rose out of them?